Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone. We are part of Hope Medical Scholars, which is a mentorship program founded through Harvard Medical School. Sort of the main goal of the program is to provide mentorship in sort of the medical school and dental school application process to students who are mostly underrepresented in medicine and may not have like a family member in medicine or sort of um, have an in-depth understanding of how the process works. Um, and as part of the program, we put on these webinars, sort of demystifying the application process. Um, so far we've done like an overview of the MD process. We've done a personal statement webinar. This will be work and activities. We'll also be doing like a gap year panel, secondaries, and interview prep webinars as well. So if you want to find out about those, I would recommend following us at Hope Medical Scholars on Instagram, because that's sort of where we keep people updated on what's going on. Um, okay, great. So yeah, this is our board. So on the call, you have me and Alejandro. My name is Katie. I'm the president of Hope this year. And I'll let Alejandro do a brief intro of himself as well.
Hi everyone. My name is Alejandro. I'm an M1. I'm from Washington State, and really excited to get to talk to you all today.
Yep, and I'm also an M1, and I'm from Nebraska. These are some other members of our board. That's Mickey. She is the MD PhD liaison, if any of you are interested in that. Claudia is the Dean of Dentistry, and Shauna is our treasurer. And then there's Noor, who's our Dean of Outreach, who reads all our applications for the program. Besmira as well. And Veronica is our social media chair. And these are our founders, Troy and Bartan. They're both in residency now, off doing great things. So hopefully we'll be all of you one day. Okay, awesome. And with that, I'm gonna let Alejandro sort of kick us off.
All right. Hi everyone. So today we're gonna go over the working activities section. And so for those of you who are getting to learn what the med school application process entails, so there's really two big components to it. There's the primary statement, which is just going to be just a long essay format around 5,000 characters of where you're answering the general question of why medicine. And the work activities is going to be a different section where it's the idea is that it's going to be um, kind of like another way to kind of talk more about yourself. And the way it works is that there's these activities, right? And they're pretty much like five subparagraphs or kind of a diary where you have, 15 opportunities to talk about the things that you've done throughout undergrad. And so at maximum, there's 15 of them. And so you don't need to fill them up all, but we're going to go through here and talk about what working activities means. And so within those 15, there's going to be three that are called your most significant activities. And so for your most significant activities, you're gonna have a little bit of extra space to talk more about what that specific activity entailed. And the other 12 are just gonna be kind of these smaller kind of like descriptions of what these activities were. And so one of the key principles is that um, you know, you don't have to fill up all 15, but ideally you want to fill up at least like 80%. So many of the top applicants that matriculate into med school have around 10 or more working activities that they turn in. And the goal with these is not to sound redundant. It's an opportunity for you to talk about yourself. And so the best way to do that is to, you know, to a lot of times what people do is that they kind of treat it like a resume because I feel like a lot of you are maybe familiar with more of how that is written. And in a resume, it's very like bullet point formatted where you talk about exactly what you did very briefly and concisely. And in that environment, it's like it makes sense because when you're applying a job, people are just reading them really quickly in 10 seconds. You just want to know quickly what are the tangible skills you have. But in med school applications, very different. You want to kind of like create kind of a narrative where you don't necessarily like come flat out and say what you did. You more tell the story, and kind of through that story, you kind of show what you did through that specific activity. And so for those general activities, the smaller ones, the ones that are 12, where you have 12 entries, you can only write 700 characters, including spaces and punctuation marks. And so usually the format that's recommended for that is the first three sentences, you kind of like kind of have to state pretty quickly like what you did. Like let's say you were volunteering at a hospital, you gotta say like what the hospital name was, like the location of it, and what your general role was. And then the rest of it, you kind of have to tell that story of like what you did and what you learned from that activity, and kind of like you have to do it in a way where you can condense it down into this smaller amount of space. 700 characters is not a lot, but that's why in the most significant activities you're gonna have a lot more space to talk about that because you get the standard 700 characters, but you also get around 1,300 characters to tell, expand upon a lot more of a specific memory or event that happened that was very memorable to you and shaped of why you want to become a physician. And so typically paragraph format is generally favored. There are some situations where bullet points are fine, such as if you're just wanting to talk about your shadowing, you just want to say how many hours you put into it, or if you want to dedicate one of your working activities section to like your research or scholarly activities, where there it is appropriate to just put down maybe your publication, poster presentation, and things of that nature, where um, you just kind of want to dump a bunch of things and you don't really have space to really talk about um, what was actually done. I've seen people also kind of like dump their scholarships into like one activity where they say the scholarship they got or like a fellowship, and that's how I see some people also use one of their activities. And so there is kind of a classification with your activities. There are the activities that you've actually done, and there's ones where you have anticipated hours. And so once you fill out the AMCAS application, it will ask you for how many hours you put into it, and then you can denote it as completed hours and also anticipated hours. So anticipated hours are just hours you anticipate to complete further on. But traditionally, you want your working activities to be things you've already done throughout your undergrad, and so most of it should be completed. Um, Furthermore, don't be afraid to include a hobby. I definitely recommend to include one or two. You really want to show yourself that you're much more unique and dynamic than just being a student and being involved with a bunch of extracurriculars. Like it can literally be anything, such as if you love dancing, if you love cooking, if you love lifting weights or running. This is a great opportunity to talk about that too. And it doesn't have to be something where you achieve something amazing, like you won like a competition. It can just be something that you like to do because it makes you happy, and just like talk about why it makes you happy. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you get three slots for your most meaningful experiences. And usually these should be experiences that are really transformational, that have impacted you in a variety of different ways and has really motivated you to want to pursue a career in medicine. And one thing I want to emphasize with your most meaningful is that your most meaningful is one that when you're interviewing for your medical schools, that your interviewer is probably going to get your personal statement and your most meaningfuls. And so you should really, really I would treat these as like as important as your personal statement because um, one piece of advice I've heard with your most meaningful is that it should be a type of experience where you can spin off and write about it in three different ways, such as like there should be three different stories you can weave out of your most meaningful. And a lot of times in your interview, they might even ask you, okay, this is a really meaningful experience to you, but can you tell me more about this experience? So from there, you got to pivot and talk about something else that was really influential for you. And so as I mentioned, readers love stories, and so try to figure out a way to kind of make your most meaningful into a kind of narrative. And it doesn't have to be a very complicated piece of creative work where all your 15 activities kind of work together like a piece of prose or something like that. No, it's just independent to that activity. Most specifically with your most meaningfuls, because you're not going to have a lot of space in your other working activity sections where you only have 700 characters. So for these three, really try to spend time and try to create a very unique kind of narrative. Um, like I mentioned, it should not be dry like a resume. Like it should not be, just like bullet format, read like that. It shouldn't be something that doesn't really like breathe life. Um, um, One thing I do want to emphasize is that please be honest when you report your start and end dates and the total number of hours you put in. Um, if you have this activity that you put maybe like 1,000 hour or you kind of maybe like play around with the start and end hours, like they'll know in the interviews and they'll just probe you. They'll easily figure it out during the interviews. They'll just ask you questions, and then if you don't have really good responses that reflects you putting in a high number of hours into a certain activity, then it's not going to look very good onto you. So please just, I know like there's always that stress of like med school admissions where it's like you want to make it seem like you've done a lot of clinical shadowing or a lot of research, but I highly recommend you guys to just report as honestly as you can, and because I mean these guys have been doing this for decades. Like you're not going to get one over them, and so just be honest throughout the entire application process. And one way of that is when you're reporting your hours, because in the end you do have to report a point of contact, But I mean, it depends on institutions. Some might check. I think a majority don't because they just receive so many applications. It just doesn't. It just wouldn't be good. I'm not sure if they really reference check these contact points, but I do recommend you guys to report them honestly. As I mentioned, you have to report contact information for someone that would be a point of contact for that activity. And so, start thinking right now of who that person could be. And if you do list them, I would highly recommend you to contact them and just tell them, hey, I'm listing you down as a work and activity section, and just tell them what that entails. That it will just entail that the med school might contact you to ask you about if I had participated in this activity and whether if I had done these things that I reported on my med school application. And so, as I mentioned, don't underestimate the section. I think the section is just as important as the personal statement. Interviewers will run through these and pick out some of these activities and straight up ask you about these in your interview. And so, for your working activities, there's these bins, these categories where you can kind of lump your activities in, and so you have to kind of label it. So it's kind of like the standard, like for example, if it's like a hobby or something you did in school that you're really passionate about, those had to do with art, being artistic. There's a category for that. Community service, volunteer, or you can list as medical or not medical. I'm not going to run through all of them, but there's hobbies, extracurricular activities, conferences, honors awards, athletics, leadership. You can distinguish between paid medical and paid non-medical activities. And so if you worked at a hospital as like a clinical research associate, or if you work in a research tech lab, these would be kind of the categories you would use. And here, physician shadowing, that's another one. Yeah, these are just general classification you can categorize your working activities with. So now I'll pass it off to Katie, who will show you some examples.
Yeah, so this is sort of the start of our common questions section. So I know it can be kind of tricky if you've done a lot of shadowing and knowing how to input that. So there's actually like a few different ways you can do it, and this is just how I chose to do it. Um, so typically, if you have like a bunch of different shadowing experiences, this is like an example of a time when, um, like Alejandro mentioned, you could put things in sort of like a bullet point format. And then as you can see, I added like one sentence at the bottom of kind of like an overarching takeaway I took away from shadowing, but that's not necessarily needed. Um, and then the contact person I put for this experience was the person who I had shadowed the most. Um, However, if you have participated in fewer shadowing experiences, but they were longer, you could actually put those in separately and include more of a description of like the patient population you saw, what you learned, like what you took away from the experience, how you hope to be a physician, sort of like how the physician demonstrated qualities that you hope to emulate, um, all things like that you could write about, or like an interesting patient moment, because as Alejandro said too, readers love stories. So anytime I think you can incorporate like a specific story, that's always really great. But that's just one way to do shadowing. And then with the honors and awards section, as well, this one can also be a little bit tricky. Um, so there's also two ways to do this. You can either list all the awards you've received, similar to how you saw the shadowing format. Here it's important that you want to put your hours as 0. That's just what the AAMC generally recommends. So you don't want to put like how many hours it took you to like make the poster or like whatever you won the award for, just put 0. Um, However, one way to save space here is if you won an award that is attached to a different activity that you talk about, you can mention the award in that activity. So an example I talk about here, if you won like a top student researcher award, you can include that in the research experience entry. And that could be a way to like save yourself some character space under the awards section if you wanted to list more things. So just things to think about. This is another area where you could do bullet points and that would be totally feasible. Another question that we get is publications. So you want to try to put all your publications under one entry. One way to save space doing that is if it's more than 7 authors, just put et al. After the first three. So only list the first three last names. Make sure to use the AMA format. That's the American Medical Association format. Um, and if you have a publication listed, that research should be discussed somewhere in your application. It doesn't necessarily have to be in work and activities, but it should be talked about somewhere, especially if it was significant enough for you to get a publication on it. Okay. Alejandro, do you want to go through this and then I can go through my examples?
Yeah, no problem. And so here in this slide, we're just going over just kind of like a general exercise you can practice right now, just to talk kind of like to help you start brainstorming for your um, once you start drafting your working activities. And so here you can kind of just break it up. So think about the activity you want to write about, and you can just rewrite this and just kind of answer these 4 questions. So what were the responsibilities? So essentially, what did you do in this activity? So for me, like for example, like I volunteered at a free clinic in Seattle when I was an undergrad. And so what did I do? So I showed up at the clinic from 6 to 8 a.m. to help UW medical students interpret for Spanish-speaking patients. And that was my main responsibility. And what was my impact? I helped patients who did not have health insurance get questions answered about their health or receive free glucose screening, COVID screening, and just talk about things like what was the actual impact on in my case to the patients I was serving, and talk about the qualities that you demonstrated. So just think about theirs, like you showed, you know, my ability to go between 2 languages, obviously with the Spanish interpreting, but also showing empathy to help patients who were undergoing a difficult time understand, just to kind of be there with them as they're going through their medical challenges and the challenges they face, not being able to access medical care or have health insurance or just being stuck in kind of this difficult situation, and kind of grab all of that and kind of connect that
Colon.
to the lessons that you learned. And so, what did I learn? That, socioeconomics, social determinants of health have a huge impact on a person's ability to access healthcare. And so, this should kind of write itself, honestly. Like if you're having to think very hard about this activity, so the one of the tips I give is that it probably shouldn't be one of your activities, just because like this should kind of flow naturally, and you might just need time to kind of like condense it down to kind of like a nice concise format. But a lot of these activities should kind of flow easily just from the kind of the experiences you have. You might have to have a reminder just from like if you do have a journal where you kind of kept um, like these activities kind of written down, maybe revisit that, or even talk to a friend or kind of your advisor and talk to them more about like if you're having like kind of a block and kind of really trying to figure out how to emphasize some of the important aspects of the activity. It's perfectly fine to do. You don't have to kind of do this on your own. You can lean on people that you've worked with in the past. And so for the most meaningful, that one should be a little bit different, where it's like it's this, but you should really focus on like a specific situation or like an event that really, really was transformative to yourself. And you can kind of um, follow this type of kind of like focus on the impact, qualities, demonstrating the lessons you learn. But it should be a lot more deeper than the 700 characters that they give you. It should be kind of like a paragraph from your personal statement. It should go that deep. And so here's an example of Timmy who did a global health activity. And so I won't read it out to you, but he just talks about his experience helping with the tailgating, and it doesn't have to be something specifically connected to medicine. It could just be something that maybe you worked a part-time job, or if you did something that was really impactful to you, but doesn't necessarily connect to medicine. It's perfectly fine to bring up those examples too, as long as it shows. So one thing I do recommend you all to do is the AMC has something called the it's like the pre-competencies that every medical student should have, and kind of go through there and kind of like look at those and see how kind of your activities tie into that. And so those can be ways how you can kind of get these activities or these things you've done in your life that you feel like have no connection to medicine, but they really do, and kind of go through there and just kind of connect it. And so like, one that's on there is being like punctual, being a leader. And there's a lot of ways you can show leadership that isn't necessarily related to medicine. So like I have some friends who felt like that they didn't get quality leadership experience in undergrads, and they would tell me that they just don't know how any other way they can display that. And there's multiple ways you can do that. Like for example, if you're doing a gap year and you're working at a job somewhere, like you can start like like an action task force to address a problem that you have in the workplace or the community or something that your job is directly connected to, that you feel like there needs to be a different approach or a different way of solving things. It doesn't necessarily have to be this huge group. It can be you and maybe one or two other coworkers, or like there's many ways for you to display the leadership that doesn't necessarily have to follow kind of like the traditional way that people kind of represent it through their med school application that you kind of see a lot floating around on the internet. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of be creative. And like if you feel like um, you ran out of time, I don't think that's ever true. There's tons of ways for you to be creative and try to I guess develop yourself as you're applying. But this is more for people who are applying next cycle because I know this current cycle is coming up in a month, and so there's in that case there's probably not a lot of time to beef those up. And so the slide examples of showing versus telling. And so here, this is supposed to highlight the differences between telling and showing. And so for here, telling, I shadowed an emergency physician during rounds. Here, I'm just telling you what I did. But showing is, I supported emergency physicians during rounds by ensuring that patients were comfortable during their stays by offering adequate snacks, drinks, blankets. Another example, I observed neurosurgery consults. I observed how, the show an example, I observed how physicians demonstrated good bedside manner by encouraging questions and providing reassurance to develop trust with their patients. You can just tell, like, even though like telling and showing, they might be like getting to the same point, but the showing examples just like kind of like put you in a situation where you're kind of like with the student and the physician as they're going through their rounds, as they're talking to patients, and like these are things that you're not necessarily telling me that you're directly observing neurosurgeons doing consults or emergency physicians during rounds, but I can get that from the writing, and it just paints a much better environment, and it's a lot nicer to read.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much, Alejandro. So here we just want to talk about some specific examples. So this would be an example of a way you could talk about a research project. Um, so this was a project that I worked on for a little over 2 years. This was my longest project in undergrad. And when talking about research, sort of like the
No.
basic the basic format that I followed was talking about like sort of the overview of the project, what it was about. You can see I do that in sort of like the first sentence. The second two sentences, usually you want to talk about what you specifically did. Um, and then the final sentence, I usually reserve to talk about like some connection to medicine or what I took away from the project. So here, my takeaway was how this project instilled a curiosity in me in how disease influences physiology and vice versa in medicine, and how this relationship can be studied to improve clinical outcomes. So if any of you have done research, I think this is like a nice format to follow. It's sort of what the project was, what you did, what you took away, what you learned. And again, this whole thing is only like 5 sentences, so it doesn't have to be like super, super in-depth or particularly reflective, but great. And yeah, try to be honest about the hours, because as Alejandro said, I actually was questioned on the hours for different things in a lot of different interviews. So if you do put down a certain number of hours, just be prepared to talk about like really the breakdown of what went into those hours. So this is just another example of this was actually a more like minor activity that I did in college, sort of as like a student advisor slash peer mentor for freshmen who were incoming into my major. So as you can see, sort of it's actually like a similar format to the research. The first sentence, I kind of just say like what the position was. That's another thing. Don't assume adcoms necessarily like know what you're talking about. Like when you say that you were like a peer mentor, um, don't necessarily assume that they know like 100% what that means and what goes into that. So yeah, my first sentence, I talk about just what the position was. Um, Second sentence, I say like what I did. I routinely checked in with students. Um, and then this one, I actually spent a little bit more time talking about what I took away from the experience. So some key takeaways were discovering the importance of prioritizing mental health, um, trying to incorporate students' hobbies into our outings because a big theme. This was actually another factor too, is I tried to incorporate sort of like the theme of my application into as many places that I could. So a big theme for my personal statement was providing very individualized care to patients. And so I tried to weave that theme in throughout my examples too. So here I say I enjoyed incorporating the students' hobbies and passions into our group outings. So sort of another smaller example of me providing individualized care in a way. Um, so yeah, those are sort of the main things I wanted to highlight with this example. Okay. So that kind of covers the activities that are like the 700 character limit. We also wanted to talk a little bit about how to choose your three most meaningful. Um, so all experiences are fair game. It is generally recommended that you choose one medicine related one if you can. Um, Another thing to consider is it can sometimes be nice if one of those activities happens to align with a letter of recommendation you received, because that can kind of like bolster the impact and give it some more credibility. Um, so, for example, I was a student athlete in college, and that was one of my most meaningful because one of my rec letters was also from the coach of the team. So sometimes those things can kind of go hand in hand. Definitely not mandatory, just like something to think about if that maybe fits your situation in any way. Um, Another thing to think about is trying to show different sides of yourself. So I know I said it can be nice to have one medicine related example, but at the same time, you don't necessarily want your whole application to be medicine, medicine, medicine because they want people who are well-rounded physicians. So if you have like research, medicine, volunteering, um, just yeah, just try to show yourself as being like a well-balanced person. And the meaningful activities can be a good way to do it. Um, and in your most meaningfuls that are not directly related to medicine, it can be really nice if you have like a few sentences at the end that link it back to how it's related to medicine. And we'll show an example of that as well. Um, don't necessarily force it, but it's helpful to do. Okay. So this was one of my most meaningful experiences. This was labeled as a community service, not medical slash clinical. Just for a little background, this was a club where we brought high schoolers onto campus, taught them how to swim and row, followed by SAT preparation. So it wasn't medicine related at all. Um, so as you can sort of see in the most meaningful, you still have the chance to do the experience description. So here in the experience description, I would very much focus on sort of like the bread and butter, the two questions. What was the activity? What did you do? Um, and then under the most meaningful remarks, I would really recommend that you tell a story of some kind or have it be much more reflective. Um, so here, just to break it down for you, you can see that I talk about what the club is. I had a leadership position in the club, so I talk about what I did in the leadership position. And under most meaningful remarks, I told a story about a student that I worked with in my time throughout the club. And then sort of the important part of this is that at the end, I try to connect it back to medicine by, say, working with the achievers who were the high schoolers in the program, helped me become confident, supporting those from different backgrounds than my own. The growing diversity in the US population demands a healthcare community that is knowledgeable of the disparities that affect those from diverse backgrounds. So I wouldn't say that was like incredibly profound, but I think it is important to show admissions committees that you are thinking about how the activities that you do connect to being a doctor and your application in general. So yeah, all things to think about. Um, so we just have another example here. Um, Sort of similar. Um, this one was actually more clinically related, but they followed the same sort of format as I did under the experience description, just sort of saying what they did. They say, as a fundraising committee member, I did XYZ. This part is like a little bit more bland, I would say. You just kind of like say what you did, what it was, what your impact was. And then you can see under their most meaningful remarks, they tell a very specific story. They have quotation marks as well, um, sort of showing their inner monologue. Um, and then they talk about their what their takeaway is, that sometimes they realize you have to fail to succeed, um, and that they do have a voice. They can use it. They can help make a difference. So this one, they didn't necessarily need to explicitly connect to medicine because it's a global health opportunity. So just a few different ways to approach it. Awesome. This is just one more example. This one isn't written out in the paragraph format like we would recommend, but this is just an example of like walking through the activity that Alejandro mentioned earlier and sort of like how to get started crafting your most meaningful. So I would go through like filling in these bullet points of what your responsibilities were, what your impact was, aka what you specifically did, the qualities demonstrated. Alejandro mentioned the AAMC core competencies. I would definitely take a look at those and make sure you're kind of covering them in different activities. Lessons you learned, and maybe like a story you could tell that pertains to the lessons and the qualities. And then this is the final paragraph that they wrote according to that activity. Um, so yeah, I'll let you guys read through that. I see that there's some questions in the chat. Um, so I think what we're gonna do is, since there's about 30 of you, um, we might break into breakout rooms if that sounds okay with you, Alejandro, and then maybe we can field some questions from there.
Sounds good to me.
So that way you can ask a little bit more individual questions. So I'm gonna create the breakout rooms now. So go ahead and join.